scratching came from somewhere inside the walls of my cabin, a persistent, deliberate sound that started precisely at 3:17 a.m. for the third night in a row. I lay frozen in my bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, knowing that whatever was making that noise wasn't a desert rodent or a branch scraping against the siding. The scratching followed a pattern. 3 quick scrapes followed by silence, then 3 more, almost like it was communicating. When I finally gathered the courage to press my ear against the wall, the scratching stopped immediately, replaced by what sounded like shallow breathing. I'd moved to this remote cabin in the Nevada high desert 3 months ago, seeking solitude after my divorce and the subsequent breakdown that cost me my job in Seattle. The isolation had been therapeutic at first, with nothing but vast stretches of scrubland, strange rock formations, and star-filled skies to keep me company. My nearest neighbor was 11 miles away, an elderly man named Harris, who checked on me once a week, bringing supplies and brief conversation. I had been careful to secure the cabin each night, ritualistically checking windows and doors before sunset, a habit born from rational precaution rather than fear. But last week, I returned from a hike to find my front door unlocked, though I was certain I had locked it. 2 days later, I discovered my hiking boots rearranged, now facing the opposite direction. Yesterday morning, I found strange markings in the dust outside my bedroom window. 5 parallel lines, too precise to be animal tracks. Sleep-deprived and increasingly paranoid, I grabbed my flashlight and phone to investigate the source of the scratching. The cabin's old wiring meant the electricity was unreliable at best, and tonight, the power was out again. As I moved toward the wall, my flashlight beam caught something on my bedroom floor that made my blood run cold. Footprints, not mine, led from beneath my bed to the closet, small and barefoot with oddly elongated toes. Even as I stared in disbelief, I heard a soft thump from inside the closet, followed by what sounded unmistakably like a child's giggle. With trembling hands, I dialed Harris's number, never taking my eyes off the closet door. The call wouldn't connect, the no service message mocking my growing panic. This wasn't entirely unusual in the high desert, where cell reception was spotty at best, but the timing couldn't have been worse. I backed slowly toward my bedroom door, the floorboards creaking beneath my weight, each step deliberate and careful. The giggles from the closet stopped abruptly, replaced by an unnatural silence that somehow felt even more threatening. I considered my options. I could flee the cabin entirely, but my truck was parked nearly a quarter-mile down the rough path, and running through the desert at night came with its own dangers. I decided to retreat to the kitchen, where I kept an old revolver, a parting gift from my father, who worried about my isolation. As I backed into the hallway, the temperature dropped dramatically, my breath suddenly visible in front of me, despite it being summer in Nevada. Photos I'd hung on the walls began to tremble, not violently, but with subtle, consistent movement, as if something was disturbing the very foundation of the cabin. In the kitchen, I fumbled for the gun in the drawer, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the room. When I finally grasped the cold metal handle, I felt a momentary relief that quickly evaporated when I turned to find all the kitchen chairs had been rearranged while I'd been facing the drawer, now positioned in a perfect circle in the center of the room. On the table sat a small, crude doll made from twigs and what looked disturbingly like human hair. Its construction fresh and deliberate. I raised the gun toward the hallway, hearing soft footsteps approaching from my bedroom. The flashlight began to flicker, its beam weakening, as if something was draining its energy. Through the dying light, I caught glimpses of movement at the end of the hall. Not just one figure, but several small shadows moving with unnatural coordination. The footsteps stopped just outside the kitchen doorway, still hidden in darkness. Then, a voice spoke, childlike yet ancient. The words unclear, but the message somehow penetrating directly into my mind with thoughts of the vast, empty places in the desert where things had been buried and forgotten, of spaces beneath the earth where daylight never reached, of entities that had existed in this harsh landscape long before humans arrived. Morning came with merciful brightness, the harsh desert sun streaming through the windows, as if the night's events had been nothing but an elaborate nightmare. I found myself slumped against the kitchen wall, the revolver still clutched in my hand, unfired. The chairs were back in their original positions, the twig doll nowhere to be seen. Had I imagined everything? The stress of isolation playing tricks on my exhausted mind. I almost convinced myself of this comforting explanation until I noticed the fine layer of reddish dust covering the kitchen floor, forming those same 5 parallel lines I'd seen outside my window days earlier. Harris arrived that afternoon for his weekly check-in, immediately noticing my disheveled appearance and the wild look in my eyes. As I recounted the night's events, his initially skeptical expression gradually shifted to one of grim recognition. "You're not the first to experience strange things out here," he finally admitted, lowering his voice despite us being alone. "This land has history most folks don't want to know about." He explained that the high desert had been considered sacred and forbidden by native tribes long before European settlement, a place where the boundary between worlds was unnaturally thin. According to local legends, something had been disturbed decades ago during a mining operation, something that should have remained buried deep beneath the ancient rock formations visible from my cabin window. Harris suggested I leave immediately, return to Seattle, or anywhere with more people around. But some combination of stubborn disbelief and morbid curiosity kept me rooted. Instead, I asked him about the mining operation, learning it had been abandoned suddenly in 1967 after several workers disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Before leaving, Harris reluctantly shared an old journal he'd kept hidden for years, belonging to one of the missing miners. The faded pages described increasingly strange occurrences leading up to their disappearances, tools moving on their own, unexplained cold spots deep in the mine shafts, and most disturbing, the sounds of children playing where no children should be. That night, I fortified the cabin as best I could, placing salt lines at every threshold as Harris had instructed, and began reading the journal by lantern light, unaware that outside my window, 5 small figures stood motionless in the gathering darkness, watching with ancient, patient eyes. The miner's journal proved to be both illuminating and terrifying. each entry growing more frantic as the writer documented the escalating phenomena. What began as minor annoyances, misplaced equipment, strange echoes in the mine shafts, evolved into something far more sinister. The final entry, dated October 17th, 1967, mentioned a discovery deep in the mine, a chamber that shouldn't exist according to any geological survey, containing what he described as artifacts of impossible antiquity, and walls covered in symbols that hurt the eyes to look upon directly. Most disturbing was his description of small, child-sized handprints in the red clay surrounding what appeared to be an altar stone, though the handprints had too many fingers arranged all wrong. Sleep eluded me as I contemplated the journal's implications, jumping at every creak and groan of the cabin settling. Around midnight, my radio suddenly turned on by itself, tuning through stations before settling on static. Through the white noise, I could make out faint voices, speaking words I couldn't understand, but somehow recognized, as if they were accessing memories I didn't know I had. The salt lines remained undisturbed, but I noticed the temperature dropping steadily, my breath forming clouds in the increasingly frigid air. Then came a sound that made my heart nearly stop. The distinct sound of digging from directly beneath the floorboards, as if multiple hands were clawing their way up from below. I retreated to the bathroom, the only room without windows or wooden floors, clutching the revolver and a flashlight with failing batteries. The digging sounds followed, now seeming to come from inside the walls themselves. My phone lit up with a text message, despite showing no service. Coordinates, nothing more, followed by the words "we found it" from an unknown number. When I pulled up my map application, the coordinates marked a location less than a mile from my cabin in an area of unusual rock formations I'd noticed but never explored. As I stared at the screen, another message appeared. "They're hungry," followed by "come see." The digging sounds suddenly stopped, replaced by an expectant silence that somehow felt like an invitation. Against every instinct for self-preservation, I found myself drawn to investigate those coordinates, as if some external force was guiding my decision-making, planting thoughts that felt deceptively like my own curiosity. Dawn broke as I approached the coordinates, having spent the remainder of the night in a state of hypervigilance within my salt-protected bathroom. The location led to a narrow fissure between two towering rock formations, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. Common sense screamed at me to turn back, to pack my belongings and flee this cursed place. But something stronger pulled me forward, a compulsion I couldn't fight. The fissure widened into a passage that sloped gently downward, the temperature dropping with each step I took into the earth. My flashlight revealed walls covered in those same symbols mentioned in the miner's journal, appearing to shift and move when viewed from the corner of my eye. The passage eventually opened into a vast underground chamber that defied all logic, far larger than should be possible given the terrain above. At its center stood the altar stone from the journal, surrounded by dozens of child-sized figures carved from the same red rock as the surrounding walls. Each statue depicted a child with elongated limbs and too many fingers, their faces unnaturally wide with oversized eyes that seemed to follow my movements. Ancient offerings lay scattered around the altar, bones, jewelry, and objects I couldn't identify, some appearing remarkably recent. Most disturbing was a collection of photographs placed in a careful arrangement on the altar stone itself, surveillance-style images of people hiking alone in the desert, sleeping in tents, or standing outside remote cabins, including several shots of me taken over the past 3 months. As I examined the photographs with growing horror, I noticed something carved into the altar stone that hadn't been visible from a distance, a calendar of sorts, with markings indicating specific dates, including today's. The ground beneath my feet began to tremble slightly, and from deeper within the cave system came the sound of movement, many small feet approaching in perfect synchronization. The beam of my flashlight caught movement among the statues, which I suddenly realized weren't statues at all, but figures covered in the red clay of the cave, standing perfectly still until now. As they began to slowly turn toward me, their eyes reflecting my flashlight beam like animals caught in headlights, I noticed Harris standing among them, his expression apologetic but resolved, a ceremonial knife clutched in his hand. "They require an offering twice each century," Harris explained, his voice echoing unnaturally in the chamber as the small figures formed a circle around us. "I'm sorry it had to be you, but better one sacrifice than allowing them to roam free again." He described how his family had served as guardians for generations, luring a carefully selected victim to the altar when the ancient calendar indicated feeding time had come. The mining operation had disturbed the entities decades ago, resulting in multiple deaths before Harris's grandfather discovered how to appease them. "They were worshipped as gods once," he continued, "before this was desert, when water flowed freely here. They granted abundance in exchange for tribute. But when the climate changed and their followers abandoned them, they became something else. I made a desperate break for the passage, only to find my way blocked by more of the clay-covered figures emerging from hidden tunnels." Harris explained that they weren't children at all, despite their size and voices, but something ancient that had adopted this form to inspire trust and sympathy from their human prey. "They feed not just on flesh, but on fear and confusion," he said, almost academically. "It's why they played their games in your cabin, why they let you find the journal. Your terror these past weeks has been marinating you." As they closed in, I fired the revolver at Harris, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. He fell back against the altar stone, genuine surprise in his eyes, not at my action, but at something behind me. I turned to find the small figures retreating, their movements now erratic and uncoordinated. Harris laughed through bloody lips, a terrible realization dawning on his face. The Guardian's blood was never meant to be spilled here, he gasped. "You've broken something older than time." The chamber began to shake violently, rocks falling from the ceiling as the entities screeched in voices no longer childlike, but ancient and inhuman. I ran for the passage as the cave began collapsing, the unholy shrieks following me all the way to the surface. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck, speeding away from the high desert without looking back. That was 3 weeks ago. I've tried to convince myself it's over, that whatever existed in that cave was buried in its collapse. But deep down I know better. Last night, I woke to find 5 parallel lines drawn in dust on my new apartment floor. And this morning, my phone received a text from Harris's number, supposedly deactivated after his disappearance. The hunger remains. They follow,